Although she was clearly the wealthiest farm owner in the town, she still went out to the fields every day to plow the land, taking on exhausting physical labor. Even in her 60s, she kept moving tirelessly across the fields, never daring to stop. Right after finishing work in the fields, she hurried back home and worked together with her daughter to repair and replace a broken wheel. After cleaning the cowshed, she was already so exhausted that she could barely straighten her back. Even so, she still had to sell the fresh milk before her morning's work could finally come to an end. These tasks that were once meant for men had now all fallen onto Madame Sandrail's shoulders. Her son-in-law, her 2 sons, and all the young men in the town had been conscripted to the front lines. Her late husband's brother suffered from arthritis and had difficulty moving, so aside from making wine, he could not handle any heavy labor. With the harvest season fast approaching, Sandrail had no choice but to seek help from the mayor, but the mayor told her she had come too late, and now not only were there no long-term workers available, even temporary laborers were impossible to hire. At this point, the entire town was left with only the elderly, women, and children, and even the slightly stronger old men had already been hired away to harvest crops. Understanding her family's hardship, the mayor recommended a woman to her. Although the woman was young and worked as a maid, she was diligent and reliable, and her previous employers had all spoken highly of her. The girl introduced by the mayor was named Francine, an orphan who had grown up in an orphanage and had just turned 20 this year. Despite her young age, she worked as hard as any man, capable of handling heavy labor while also being skilled at managing household chores. Sandrail said she trusted the mayor, but deep down she remained doubtful. She had only decided to hire a woman out of desperation, and she still questioned the girl's true abilities. Early the next morning, Francine arrived at Sandrail's home by carriage, carrying her simple luggage. She pushed open the half-closed gate, and after entering the yard, she did not forget to shut it behind her. But when she knocked on the blue door, there was no response from inside. Looking around, she noticed a back gate in the yard, and when she walked over, she saw an elderly woman picking beans there. Sandrail welcomed her inside and asked if she knew how to handle cattle. Francine had done similar work for previous employers, so this was no challenge for her at all. Her confidence quietly impressed Sandrail, though she did not show it, and simply asked about her former employers. What seemed like a casual question was actually a test. To see how she would respond, Francine only replied that they were quite good, and it was this simple answer that made Sandrail decide to keep her. Sandrail briefly explained the general duties, which included working in the fields with her, helping her daughter Solange with housework, and tending the vegetable garden. As for wages, she promised Francine would be treated fairly, receiving 40 francs at the end of each month along with a day off every Sunday. After Solange took Francine to see her room, the uncle, who had been silent all along, finally spoke. For now, Sandrail was satisfied, but everything would depend on her performance and whether she was truly as capable as the mayor had claimed. Back in her room, Francine quietly made her bed, showing no displeasure despite the simplicity of her living conditions. Having grown up as an orphan, she had never been in a position to be picky, and her optimistic nature had taught her to accept whatever life gave her. Before the sun even rose the next day, Francine was already up tending the cattle, and after returning, she milked the cows alongside Sandrail. She did not need her employer to tell her what tasks to do. After breakfast, she went straight to the fields, skillfully plowing the land and completing work that usually required both Sandrail and her daughter Solange together. Not only did she handle the tasks assigned by her employer perfectly, she also helped the uncle with winemaking, carefully listening as he explained every step. In just one day, she had already left the entire family deeply impressed. That day, while Francine was ironing clothes, a strange girl suddenly walked in. After introducing themselves, she learned the girl's name was Marguerite, Solange's stepdaughter with no blood relation. Because the harvest season was about to begin, she had taken 3 days off from school to come back and help. That evening, the family gathered together, packing ham sandwiches to send to their loved ones in the military camp. Seeing their silence and solemn expressions, Francine tactfully chose not to speak, though being unable to help made her feel slightly uneasy. In the days that followed, she worked alongside several temporary laborers in the fields, harvesting wheat. Sandrail quietly observed from the side and noticed that not only were her movements skillful and efficient, but she also showed no signs of slacking off. At lunch, everyone silently stuffed food into their mouths, with no jokes or casual conversation, only shared over the men and their families. No one knew when the war would end or when they would finally return home safely. Although Francine could not truly feel their emotions, she could still understand there for their loved ones. Suddenly, a man appeared in the distance, and it was none other than Solange's husband, Clovis. Every conscripted soldier was granted a short leave, and this time it happened to be his turn. Clovis had clearly been deeply affected by the war, and had even begun using alcohol to numb himself. He spoke about the brutality of the battlefield as if he were an outsider, yet the glass he could not put down revealed that his heart was far from calm. Seeing the change in her son-in-law, Sandrail could not help but feel worried. Not long ago, her eldest son had returned on leave, and he too seemed very different. He had once been an ordinary schoolteacher, whose hands were meant to hold a pen, but now they carried a weapon, and a man who had never touched alcohol before had also started drinking. This war, which had been promised as a swift campaign, had now dragged on for 2 full years without ending. It was not only torment for the soldiers on the battlefield, but also a form of suffering for the families waiting for them to come home. Francine did not know how to comfort them, and the only thing she could do was make sure they would not have to worry about matters at home. After dinner, she cleaned the table and returned to her room, taking out a dress with a loose seam and carefully mending it stitch by stitch. Marguerite was surprised to discover that a maid could read and even had a graduation certificate. This made her see Francine in a new light, and she began to share a young girl's secret with her. It turned out that Sandrail's youngest son, Georges, would be returning on leave in a few days, but Marguerite had to go back to her boarding school the day after tomorrow. Thinking about not being able to see him filled her with regret. Although she did not say much about Georges, Francine could already tell from those few words that Marguerite had long been in love with him. At the same time, Solange held her husband's face and kissed him again and again. She did not know whether he would be able to return safely the next time. She had wanted to tell him that she had recently seen a doctor and been diagnosed as unable to have children, but looking at the man in front of her, broken by war, she could not bring herself to speak. During the days of her son-in-law's leave, the crops in the fields were finally completely harvested. Sandrail also kept her promise and handed Francine her wages. Francine's diligence and kindness had deeply impressed Sandrail, so even after the busy farming season ended, she was still kept on. A few days later, she sat in the yard washing bottles and singing, unaware that her angelic voice had touched someone's heart and would leave a profound mark on her own fate.
Mademoiselle Francine? Georges.
This was the first time Francine met the youngest son that Sandrail often spoke about. To her surprise, this young master was so easygoing that he allowed the workers to call him by his name. Remembering her place, Francine still remained respectful and continued to address him as Mr. Georges. Yet her heart was already in turmoil, and her awkward near collision with the gate revealed that she was still only a young woman just beginning to understand love. Before Georges returned, all the work in the fields, whether turning the soil or sowing seeds, had been done by Francine and Sandrail side by side. But Sandrail was getting older, her strength gradually fading, and their progress had slowed significantly. During Georges' few days of leave, he and Francine worked in perfect harmony, completing in half a day what would normally take 3 days. After finishing the work in the fields, Georges helped his mother chop enough firewood for the winter, as he did not know when his next leave would be. Meanwhile, Francine stayed by his side, helping to carry the wood. In just 2 days of knowing each other, a natural understanding had already formed between the two young people. Georges said that deep in the forest there was a secret spot where the trees were far more beautiful than here, and it even held a hidden treasure. As for what the treasure was, he kept it a mystery. Francine had originally thought that Marguerite and Georges were in love, so even though she felt drawn to him, she did not want to interfere in someone else's relationship. But Georges said that he had watched Marguerite grow up and saw her only as a younger sister. After confirming his feelings, Francine felt a sudden sense of relief, as if something inside her had loosened, and a quiet sense of anticipation began to rise. On the way home, Georges suddenly grew a little sad, as he would be leaving the next day to return to the army, unsure if he would come back alive. Even if he returned safely, he did not know whether he would ever see her again. Whether Francine could stay was not up to her, nor could Georges decide, as everything depended on Sandrail's attitude. That day, the mayor came again and took away a horse and a yellow cow, including the previous 2 times. He had now requisitioned a total of 2 cows and 3 horses from Sandrail's family. He promised that this would be the last time, and once the government-issued ration coupons were distributed, he would pay her what she was owed. Sandrail understood that he was doing it for the sake of the entire town. With the men all at the front lines, many households no longer even had usable livestock, and the mayor had no choice but to come asking, making it difficult for her to refuse. That evening, she and Francine went to the fields to dig up potatoes, but human labor could never compete with machines. Looking out over the endless ridges of farmland, Sandrail could not help but think of the ongoing war, wondering how much longer such days would last. At that thought, a quiet wave of sorrow rose in her heart. She knew she could not simply wait for the men to return, and had to find her own way to keep the farm running. She recalled the suggestion her eldest son had made during his last visit, urging her to buy a baler so she would not strain her back and could save a great deal of time. But because of the high cost, she had always been reluctant to spend the money, telling herself she would consider it after a better harvest. As autumn gradually faded, the cold winter arrived in the blink of an eye. Although there was little to do in the fields, Francine did not slack off. She chopped the firewood that Georges had cut during his last leave into smaller, more usable pieces. Then she worked with Sandrail, learning to press butter into neat, smooth blocks with a warm, rich color. Even though it was her first time, the finished shapes were remarkably perfect, and Sandrail could not hide the admiration on her face. This was Francine's first winter in this household. While the cold wind raged outside, Sandrail's words made her feel a deep warmth. After struggling with her thoughts for a long time, she finally wrote her first letter to Georges, telling him the good news that she had been allowed to stay, and hoping he would return safely soon. Not long after the letter was sent, Solange received devastating news that her husband had been captured by enemy forces. Sandrail comforted her sobbing daughter, saying that becoming a prisoner was not shameful. At least he was still alive, and as long as he lived, there was hope. Holding a magnifying glass, Sandrail carefully searched the map and finally found the place where her son-in-law was being held. Solange stared at that location in silence for a long time. She wiped away her tears and stood by the window, as if she could see her husband through it. As the bitter cold faded and new green shoots appeared, spring finally returned after the long and harsh winter. With Francine's help this year, Sandrail felt much less burdened, which was the first small comfort she had felt since her loved ones went to war. However, one evening, the mayor came with a grave expression. Sandrail could never have imagined that her last meeting with her eldest son had been a final farewell. The young man who had promised to return to teaching after the war had instead fallen on the battlefield, never to stand again at the podium he cherished. This became the quietest and longest night since Francine had arrived in this household. Tear marks remained on everyone's faces, and the suppressed sobs were even more heartbreaking than loud cries. She did not disturb Sandrail, but woke early the next morning, chopping wood, lighting the fireplace, and leading the cattle to the trough for water. The only person in the house she could talk to was Marguerite, who had returned from boarding school. After praying in church for the fallen soldiers, Francine unexpectedly received a reply from Georges. In the letter, he wrote that the war had already exhausted him, and his only comfort was receiving her letters. In her reply, Francine told him she would wait for his return and would do everything she could to help his mother in the meantime. 2 days after sending the letter, Francine's 21st birthday arrived. The mayor called her into his office and personally handed her a savings book, telling her it contained a large sum of 700 francs. This included money she had earned before coming of age, government subsidies, and the wages she had saved over the past few months, bringing her total savings to as much as 850 francs. Even the daughters of wealthy families did not have as much money as she did. The mayor told her that he believed she would soon marry an honest young man. At those words, Francine could only think of Georges, though she knew the gap in their status and did not dare to hope too much. After leaving the mayor's office, she did not return home right away, but walked into a shop she had never visited before. The moment she entered, she was drawn to a butterfly brooch. Although it cost as much as 18 francs, she bought it without hesitation. This gift was not meant for herself, but for Marguerite, who shared everything with her. But when she gave the brooch to Marguerite, the girl looked at her coldly and questioned why she had been secretly exchanging letters with Georges. Feeling guilty, Francine explained that Georges had only been asking about the farm. However, Marguerite could tell from the words that feelings had already grown between them. When Francine offered the brooch, Marguerite saw her as a rival and coldly drove her out of the room. Francine knew that no amount of explanation would help, and that silence was the best choice. The next day, Marguerite returned to school as her holiday ended, and Francine was given a new task. A few days earlier, Sandrail had finally made up her mind and spent a large sum to purchase a harvesting baler. The mayor said that as long as she lent the machine to 3 other households, she would receive additional government subsidies. To save more money, Sandrail agreed to his proposal. This was the first modern machine in the town, and as soon as the news spread, villagers flocked to see it. No one expected that such a seemingly simple machine could replace heavy labor, and its efficiency left everyone astonished. But what shocked them even more was Francine. An orphan raised in an orphanage displayed such remarkable aptitude that after less than an hour of learning, she was already operating the machine with ease, showing no sign that it was her first time using it. With this machine, a long-lost smile finally appeared on Sandrail's face. After all the crops had finally been harvested, Georges' long-awaited leave arrived. The family gathered together, yet a sense of sorrow lingered. They mourned the eldest son who had fallen in battle with no remains to return, and worried for the loved one captured by the enemy with no known date of return. The shadow of war was not confined to the battlefield, but seeped into the lives of every family member and soldier. Although his body had returned to the warmth and peace of home, Georges was still awakened by nightmares at night, his screams piercing through the silence. The next morning after breakfast, Georges noticed a carriage in the yard, and to his surprise, it was American soldiers coming to purchase butter and vegetables. The United States had remained distant from the conflict for a long time, staying removed from the war. Seeing them now stirred an indescribable resentment in Georges. As his emotions grew more intense, Solange quickly pulled him aside, yet the turmoil in his heart did not fade. He turned and walked toward Francine, who was hanging laundry, and asked if she would go with him to the secret place in the forest. When she nodded, his mood finally began to lift. To avoid suspicion from the family, they arranged to meet at a crossroads. After picking up Francine, the carriage drove deep into the forest, and after walking across a crystal-clear stream, they finally arrived at the place Georges had described. When Francine opened her eyes, she saw a massive rock shaped like a whale. Even more astonishing, the enormous stone was supported by 4 uneven rocks, as if a giant whale were lifted by waves, standing like a fortress. She could hardly believe it. Brushing away the moss covering the stone, at that moment, Georges' warm hand reached out and naturally slipped between her fingers. In that instant, the restraints of the world shattered, and with nature as their witness, the two lovers gave themselves completely to each other, sealing their bond in the most intimate way. That night, back in her room, Francine's heart still raced and her cheeks flushed, unaware that such sweetness would not last long. That day, when Sandrail saw the American soldiers who had come to purchase goods passing by again, she felt an ominous premonition. When she could not find her daughter after checking every room, her suspicions deepened. She quickened her pace and went to the edge of the forest, where she indeed saw her daughter adjusting her clothes. She did not confront Solange directly, but quietly returned home. That afternoon, a farmer came by and casually mentioned that people in the village were gossiping about Solange, saying she had been involved with an American soldier. Before Sandrail could fully process her daughter's situation, during dinner, Georges suddenly took Francine's hand and openly declared his feelings in front of the entire family. He did not know if he would survive his return to the army, and only wanted to tell his mother in this way that aside from family, Francine was the person he loved most. Sandrail had long been aware of their relationship, but had chosen to pretend otherwise. She liked Francine for her diligence, but that did not mean she could accept an orphan marrying into the family. In front of her son, she expressed no opinion. The next day, as usual, she prepared to drive Francine to the station, but just as the carriage left the yard, they saw an American soldier who had come to buy wine holding Francine, who was still in her nightgown, in his arms. Georges only saw what appeared to be intimacy between them, failing to notice Francine's resisting hands. From his expression, Francine realized that he had misunderstood. This was where Sandrail's cunning lay, as she did not openly oppose them, but instead used the situation to her advantage, framing Francine so that Georges would end the relationship himself. After returning, she called Francine over and told her that from that day on, she was no longer needed in the household. The reason given was that rumors were spreading about her involvement with an American soldier, damaging the reputation of the other women in the family. With one move, she achieved 2 goals, separating Georges and Francine while shifting all the gossip onto Francine, allowing her daughter Solange to remain untouched. Sandrail deliberately avoided Francine's hurt expression, only saying she had already written her a recommendation letter and would give her 2 extra months of wages. Francine looked at her with deep disappointment and did not accept her so-called kindness. The person before her was no longer the Madame Sandrail she once knew. Just as she had left 2 years ago, Francine picked up her simple bag and silently walked away from the place she had thought would become her home. When Solange learned that her mother had driven Francine away and placed false accusations upon her, guilt and anger nearly overwhelmed her. She knew her mother had done it to protect her reputation, yet nothing had happened between her and the soldier that day. At the last moment, she had restrained herself and remained faithful to her husband, never betraying her family. With nowhere to go, Francine spent the night curled up in the cowshed. Fortunately, The next day she found a new employer. It was a modest household with only a mother and daughter, as the husband had gone to the front, leaving everything to the woman. She had to care for her young daughter and manage the household alone, making it impossible to handle everything, which was why she hired Francine. On her first day, Francine worked alongside her employer building a charcoal kiln, taking on charcoal burning, a task she had never done before. Even as sweat poured down her face, she endured it. But after returning from work, she suddenly felt dizzy and nauseous.
Je cherche pas ma fille. T'es enceinte?
Her employer's words made her even more unsteady, though unwilling to believe it. After much hesitation, she decided to keep the child. During her time in the new household, she continued to write letters to Georges, yet every letter she sent was returned unopened. Even then, Francine still worried that something might have happened to him. She could never have imagined that he had simply given up on their relationship because of his mother's words and what he thought he saw that day. As winter arrived, her belly grew day by day, yet no reply from Georges ever came. Whenever someone in the town died, news would spread quickly, and the absence of bad news meant he was still alive. Realizing this, Francine gradually came to her senses. She went to visit the mayor, who had always treated her like a daughter. Seeing her condition and what she had gone through, the mayor could not help but feel heartbroken. If she told Georges and his family about the pregnancy, they might change their minds. After speaking with the mayor, Francine wrote a letter to Sandrail. She did not hope to marry into the family because of the child, but only wished for the news to be passed on to Georges, as he was the child's father. After reading the letter, Sandrail struggled internally, yet ultimately burned it to ashes without telling her son a single word. Not long after, the war that had lasted more than 4 years finally came to an end. Although Georges returned with an injured leg, he was at least alive. Sandrail brought Marguerite to the station, already seeing her as Georges' future wife. At the same time, Francine gave birth to a baby boy. Every day, she sang gentle songs to lull him to sleep. One day, after the child had fallen asleep, she went to a barber shop and cut off the long hair she had kept for more than 10 years. As the strands fell, it felt as though she was shedding a heavy past. Her new reflection in the mirror made her look far more mature. The innocence of youth quietly faded, replaced by a calm and wise presence. Accompanied by the mayor, Francine took her child to the church for baptism. Unexpectedly, as she stepped outside, she saw Sandrail standing by the roadside. Frozen in place, Francine met her gaze directly, her eyes calm as if looking at a complete stranger. In the second year after the war ended, Solange's husband finally returned safely from captivity. The entire family in the town gradually returned to their former rhythm. Sandrail's farm acquired more modern machinery, yet Georges and his brother-in-law argued endlessly over the division of land. The war had changed many people and things beyond recognition, but for Francine, a new life bound to her by blood, a substantial savings to secure her future, and a job she loved as a singer were already enough. All of this signaled that her new life was only just beginning to take root.